Okay, let's dive into a really powerful and I think very important critique of the modern world. We're going to explore this idea that we're living through a massive spiritual crisis, and we'll do it through the lens of Catholic tradition and some pretty incredible thinkers who saw all this coming. It really all starts with a feeling, right? You've probably felt this yourself. You walk into a cathedral that's centuries old, and what's the first thing you do? You get quiet, you look up, it feels like you've stepped into another reality. But then you walk into a lot of modern churches, and the vibe is totally different. It feels more like a friendly gathering, a place to talk and connect. And that difference, well, it's no accident. And this slide, this really gets to the heart of it. Traditional churches were built with a vertical focus. Everything from the arches to the spires was designed to pull your soul upward toward God, to inspire a sense of awe and mystery. But so many modern churches, they have a horizontal focus. They're built to foster a sense of community among the people gathered there. One encourages silence and adoration, the other invites dialogue and participation. This shift in architecture is really just a symptom of a much, much deeper change. So where did this deeper change come from? Well, according to this whole critique, it's rooted in a massive shift in the liturgy, the way Catholics worship, that really took off after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. The argument is that when you change how people pray, you fundamentally change what they believe. Now, at the absolute core of this was how the Mass itself was understood. For nearly 2,000 years, it was overwhelmingly seen as a sacrifice, a mystical and transcendent event. The priest faced the altar with the people, what's called ad orientem, or to the east, leading everyone toward God. After the council, though, the emphasis shifted to the Mass being a communal meal. The priest turned around to face the people versus populum, and the universal sacred language of Latin was replaced with local languages to make it easier to understand. And you can see how this completely transformed the priest's role. He went from being a mediator, someone who kind of disappears into the ancient ritual to guide you into the divine mystery, to being more like the host of a gathering. His personality, his performance, suddenly became way more central. The critique here is that instead of opening a window to the sacred, the priest now often stands in front of it. Just think about this quote for a second. This really captures that traditional understanding of what was happening on the altar. It wasn't just a nice get-together. It was a direct encounter with the living God, an event so powerful, so real, it should fill you with both incredible joy and a kind of holy fear. It was seen as, well, dangerous. Yeah, that sense of danger and awe even extended to receiving communion. The move from kneeling to standing, from receiving on the tongue to in the hand, it was all done to make it more accessible and joyful. But the critics of this change argue that it accidentally weakened the deep belief in the real presence, and it also kind of glossed over the idea that receiving communion unworthily is, as St. Paul says, spiritually dangerous. So this is where things get really interesting, because the critique broadens out. Were these changes just some internal housekeeping within the church? Or were they actually a reflection of a massive cultural earthquake, a huge rebellion against the past that was happening everywhere in the 20th century? To really get this, we have to talk about tradition itself, and not just as nostalgia for the good old days, but seeing it as a kind of distilled, time-tested wisdom. You know, C.S. Lewis actually gave a brilliant name to this modern prejudice. He called it chronological snobbery. It's that automatic, unthinking belief that if something is old, it must be bad, and if it's new, it must be better. From this point of view, ancient rituals aren't seen as containers of profound wisdom, they're just primitive relics that we need to get rid of. And the economist Thomas Sowell has this powerful counter-argument. He basically says that tradition is the result of a massive, centuries-long process of trial and error. The customs and beliefs that survive, they survive for a reason, because they work, often for complex reasons we've long forgotten. Tossing them aside casually is like throwing away the only map you have in the middle of a forest. This quote from Emerson, which was also a huge part of J.R.R. Tolkien's worldview, just nails the problem. We get better and better at doing things, right? Our technology, our methods, our means are constantly improving. But the purpose for why we do them, our ends, seems to get worse and worse. We've built these incredibly efficient tools to construct a more and more meaningless world. So for perfecting our tools, but losing our purpose, where does that lead? Well, the historian Cipolla came up with this really blunt tool for analyzing this, called the law of stupidity. Now, he argues that a stupid act has nothing to do with IQ. It's defined purely by its outcome. It's any action that harms other people while bringing zero benefit and maybe even harm to the person doing it. It's a total lose-lose situation. And if you apply Cipolla's idea here, the critique becomes razor sharp. If these ancient traditions were like a form of distilled wisdom that nourished people spiritually for centuries, then dismantling them with no real, tangible benefit, while at the same time we see churches emptying and faith declining, well, that looks like a perfect example of a lose-lose, negative-sum, stupid act. Okay, so this brings us to the absolute core of the entire argument. The changes in worship, the arrogance of the modern age, all of that, according to this critique, are just ripples on the surface. The real cause is something much, much deeper. So everything we've talked about, the shift from sacrifice to meal, the dismissal of tradition, the loss of beauty, they are not the root cause of this spiritual crisis. They're the symptoms. They're like the fever that tells you the body is sick. They are the visible proof of a far more fundamental problem. So what is it then? What's the one thing? What is the single foundational cause that this analysis says explains this whole great unraveling of the modern world? And here it is, the diagnosis, delivered with just chilling simplicity by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. After he survived the horrors of the Soviet Gulag, he spent his life trying to figure out what happened. He studied the revolution that killed 60 million people, and he said the most accurate explanation he ever found was what the old folks told him when he was a kid. Men have forgotten God. That's it. That's the cause. Everything else is just a consequence. So, if the problem is a great forgetting, then what's the solution? Well, the answer isn't about trying to turn back the clock. It's about recovering a lost part of what it means to be human. You see, the way forward isn't just about nostalgia. It's not about wishing we were back in the 1950s. It's about a conscious, living re-engagement with something called sacred memory. It means remembering not just with our brains, but with our souls and our bodies, through ritual, through beauty, through prayer. There's actually a theological term for this, anamnesis. And it's so much more than just recalling an event from history. It's a special kind of sacred memory that happens in the liturgy that makes a past reality, like the sacrifice on the cross, truly and sacramentally present right here, right now. It's the engine that keeps tradition alive and powerful, not just some historical reenactment. It's how we remember God. And that really leaves us with one final, and I think crucial question. When a whole culture, a whole society, suffers from this kind of collective spiritual amnesia, when it loses its power of anamnesis, its living connection to the sacred, what happens to its soul? And more importantly, what happens to its future?